Today's video deals with the broken gas door lid mechanism on my 2006 Ford F-150 that caused it just to flap in the breeze. The white post shown here had the head broken off that holds the spring in place. Join me as I perform a repair I promised in an earlier video, and let's get after it. I purchased this assembly off eBay, and it allows me to see how the arm is supposed to work so I can begin the repair of my broken one. To see the earlier video on removal and replacement of this assembly, click on the link in the upper right of the screen. Note how the head is offset, allowing the spring to compress and release along with the arm movement. When the arm is extended and retracted, the broken post moves with it. This will be important relative to my repair. I began by drilling out the broken post, starting at the top using a smaller bit. Because I can't get purchase with my drill bit on the pointed bottom, I first cut the tip of the post off flat, then drill it out. I switched to a larger bit that fits the housing opening perfectly, and finished this part by drilling all the way through to the bottom. Before continuing with my repair, I want to think of a couple of scenarios where your repair may be different. What if my return spring had been broken? What would I have done? Well, no need to speculate. This is what I did do as a demonstration. I found that a coat hanger was the perfect circumference to rebuild the spring. I made these strategic cuts, then formed the hanger top around a baseball bat to properly curve it. I then used 2 sets of pliers to bend the tip to the same shape as the old spring. You will note that this end requires a Z bend, and it matches perfectly. But what if the post was broken off? Well, I mocked up a cardboard model to demonstrate how I would have taken a machine bolt and fed it up from the bottom after drilling out the broken post hole. Attach a regular nut to the top, then the spring, then a nylon nut. This nylon nut allows the spring to be secured without having to tighten it all the way down to allow for the spring to pivot. You can see here how the spring would then attach to the pivot head, but there's still an issue underneath because the head of the machine bolt will interfere with the arm movement. Although this machine bolt's head is not that thick, the tolerance of the arm to the inner case is very tight. To fix this, I would mark the movement of the arm to get a start and end point and file off some material matching the thickness of the machine bolt head here. This would then allow for the arm to move in and out without hitting the bottom of the machine bolt. As it is, the existing post is molded into the case with no protrusions underneath. Back to my repair, I managed to locate a scrap rod I had laying around. It fits the inner arm exactly. And now the fun begins. First, the rod must be bent on one end. I then marked the bottom at an arbitrary spot, allowing for enough room for some threads and a nut. The rod is then cut at the mark. The trial fit looks good. Using my tap and dice set, I need to cut some threads on the rod. A bit of cutting oil is used. And the threads are complete. I plan on pinning the post to the inner arm shaft because the post must move when the arm moves. As such, I'm going to begin by drilling out some access holes into the outer case. I aligned the center of the post inside the case and marked these two locations for drilling. Now that the starter holes are drilled, I switched to a larger bit. With the arm and rod inserted, I sighted the center line and used my punch to score the inner plastic arm for drilling with a smaller bit. In this next step, I positioned the head where I want it and hold it in place because when I drill through the plastic, I want the drill bit to score marks on the rod. Using eye protection, I carefully drill holes into the rod at the two marks. Doesn't drilling through the rod weaken it? Yes, but pinning the rod will not be the only method of securing the rod to the arm. Stay tuned. By reinserting the rod and lining up the existing holes, I can drill through the rod and the back side of the arm. Let's do the top one first to demonstrate. I found a piece of scrap material in my shop with an existing hole and I spot welded it to the bent portion of the rod. Then performed some grinding on it to get it to the shape I needed. This only needs to be functional, not pretty. Go easy with the comments. I don't have access to a MIG welder. Remember, I said it didn't have to be pretty. But then I put the rod and new head in a vise and improperly clamped it down to attach a nut, and this happened. I had messed up the threads earlier, and while I was torquing the nut onto the shaft, it broke near the top. So let's do it again. This time I started with a large washer, did some hacksawing and grinding, and offset the hole just a little bit to take some strain off the spring. I also left room to drill another hole on the other side of the head for a different attachment point if need be. Using a couple of 1/16 inch drill bits, I temporarily pinned the rod to the inner arm, and this is the way I had envisioned it would work. To fashion the permanent pins, I located an old spring in my shop that fits the 1/16 inch holes perfectly. Withdrawing the spring material to the inner edge of the arm, I marked the outer edge for cutting. Better the pin is too long than too short, but if the length interferes with the movement, I'll take my Dremel tool and file it down. Plumber's thread tape is used to protect against the two-part epoxy I will use next. Remember, I told you earlier that pinning the rod was not the only method I had in mind of securing the rod to the arm. I used a swab with the cotton removed to mix the two epoxy ingredients and apply to the arm. The swab fits the hole precisely. As there is an access hole in the middle, I applied a liberal amount of epoxy and covered it with electrical tape to prevent the epoxy from seeping out while curing. Epoxy is then applied to each end. Wipe off any excess. The rod is coated next, up to the drilled hole at the top and down to the tape. Before the rod is fully seated, pliers are used to insert the Z portion of the spring. Also note that I drilled a second hole in the head and inserted a self-tapping screw to use as leverage for my slip joint pliers. Since the spring is in place, the tension will cause the holes not to line up, so I used the pliers to put pressure on the spring to allow me to line up the holes and set the pins in place like this. By now the 5-minute epoxy was about to cure, so I tapped the pins down securely. Wipe off any epoxy that may have gotten onto the outer case. The protective thread tape is removed. Now if you have a 10/24 nylon nut, you may skip this step. I applied some red thread lock to the rod and a regular machine nut, finger tightening only, as I don't want to bind the arm movement, just prevent the rod from sliding up or down. I applied a second nut just in case. Check it out! After 2 hours of letting the epoxy fully cure, it works like a charm. I'm just going to leave the extra screw in the head as it doesn't interfere with any movement. I feel good that the pins and the epoxy will keep the rod securely attached to the inner arm. If you're concerned about getting dust into the drilled holes, you could insert some sealed rubber grommets. I'm considering my work done and hope you had fun watching, and this project is complete.